Okay, let's unpack this. When you hear the Crusades, what first springs to mind? Perhaps epic battles, valiant knights, or maybe a stark clash of civilizations. But what if we told you the sources reveal a much richer, far more surprising story beneath that surface? A story of shifting alliances, profound cultural exchanges, and even a mystical children's march that might have inspired, well, a famous fairy tale. Today we're taking a deep dive into your sources to understand not just the what of the Crusades, but the deeper why, the how, and the often overlooked human experiences that shaped this nearly two-century period. Our mission here is to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, so you can be truly well-informed about this fascinating and, let's face it, often misunderstood era. Let's get started. So, to kick us off, what's the first thing our sources reveal that challenges a common assumption about what the Crusades actually were? Because for most of us, I think it's pretty narrowly defined.
That's a great question to start with. Probably the biggest takeaway here is that while many think of the Crusades as solely about the Christian fight to reclaim Jerusalem, which had been under Muslim dominion since 638 AD, our sources really emphasize what historians call a pluralist view.
Pluralist view, meaning,
Crusading extended far, far beyond Jerusalem. We're talking about campaigns against Muslims in Iberia, pagan peoples up in the Baltic region, even against Mongols, political opponents of the papacy, and various groups deemed heretics, like the Cathars or Hussites.
wow, so it wasn't just one singular focused movement on the Holy Land, it was much broader.
Much broader, and this wasn't a short skirmish either, was it?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
The sources make it clear this series of conflicts lasted almost 2 centuries.
2 centuries, from 1095 all the way to 1291. I mean, that scale and duration alone really challenged the simplified narrative you often hear.
That's a much, much wider scope than I think most people imagine.
Right.
So, okay, Jerusalem was clearly central to some of these campaigns, at least initially. Why was there such a powerful call to arms in the first place? What made Jerusalem so, well, extraordinarily significant to so many different groups?
Well, you have to understand its importance. For Christians, it was the place where Christ lived, walked, died. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre commemorates his crucifixion and resurrection. It's central.
Right.
For Muslims, it's incredibly holy, too. It's where Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven, marked by Al-Masjid al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock.
Okay.
And for Jews, of course, all their primary holy sites are there, including the remains of the Second Temple. So when the Seljuk Turks captured Jerusalem in 1077, Christian pilgrimage became increasingly difficult, and that certainly helped fuel the desire for intervention.
So you have this deeply sacred site for all three major monotheistic faiths, making it a constant point of potential friction. And that's where Pope Urban II steps in, right?
Yeah.
His preaching in Clermont in 1095 is such a famous event. What was his pitch, according to the sources?
Absolutely. Pope Urban II, well, he saw the Crusades as a huge opportunity. He offered absolution of sins, a complete remission to those who fought to defend Eastern Christians and restore Jerusalem to Christian hands.
A powerful incentive in that age.
Immensely powerful. But it wasn't purely, let's say, altruistic from the papal perspective. He also viewed it as a way for the often violent and sinful knights of Western Europe to channel their energies into something considered a spiritually meritorious act.
Redirecting violence.
Precisely. And at the same time, enhancing papal standing and influence. It was quite strategic.
It sounds like a spiritual win-win for many, at least from the church's viewpoint. But beyond that deep piety, which was obviously strong then, did our sources uncover other, maybe less holy motivations for people joining up? What else might have drawn them in?
That's a really crucial point the sources highlight. The often overlooked practical, sort of worldly motivations. While the idea of holy war held strong mass appeal, promising salvation from, eternal damnation, and that wasn't the only driver.
Okay.
Aspirations for honor, adventure, financial gain, even acquiring land, these all played a significant role.
Even if the church wasn't thrilled about those reasons.
Right. Even if churchmen generally frowned upon these more worldly motives, many lay people, well, they didn't seem to have much trouble accommodating them alongside their religious beliefs. For instance, some involved in the People's Crusade clearly saw it as a chance to escape poverty back home, maybe gain some wealth or power.
That makes a lot of sense, a mix of motives. Speaking of the People's Crusade, our sources mention this as an earlier, much less organized wave.
Yeah.
What happened with them in 1096? This sounds like an incredibly chaotic start.
Oh, it was. Definitely chaotic. This group certainly preceded the more organized knightly armies. It was led by these charismatic figures like Peter the Hermit and largely composed of Christians from all over Europe, mainly peasants, many seeking to escape really harsh economic conditions.
But they didn't really have a plan.
That was the problem. A severe lack of concrete planning, extreme disorganization, and this led to, well, horrific violence, notably against Jewish communities in the Rhineland.
Oh, right. The sources mention that.
Yeah, they were often given this terrible choice, convert or die. It resulted in mass deaths, synagogues were burned. It was brutal.
It sounds like what our sources call a horrifying failure.
It truly was. This largely undisciplined group was quickly and pretty easily slaughtered by Seljuk Turks in Asia Minor. It basically served as a stark warning, a model of what not to do for the later, more organized Crusades. The, short-term satisfaction of looting some places didn't build anything lasting.
So a brutal lesson learned early on. After that disaster, the more organized First Crusade pushed forward.
Yeah.
What were their major accomplishments and what kinds of challenges did they run into?
Right, this was a much more experienced force, militarily speaking. They managed to recapture the critical border city of Nicaea.
Okay, a key victory.
Yes. But then they endured a really long and incredibly difficult siege of Antioch between 1097 and 1098. And they faced immense challenges. Serious food shortages, desertions were a problem, and morale, well, it hit rock bottom at times.
How do they overcome that?
Well, there was a turning point, actually. The supposed discovery of the Holy Lance within Antioch.
The lance that pierced Christ's side.
That's the one. Whether it was authentic or not, its discovery provided this vital, almost miraculous inspiration, a huge morale boost.
Wow.
And this surge in confidence helped them finally capture Antioch and then the ultimate prize, Jerusalem in 1099. Fulfilling the basic rationale of the crusade.
And with the capture of Jerusalem and other territories, we see the birth of what the sources call the Crusader states, or Outremer. What were these places like? How did they function?
Right, Outremer. These were essentially 4 Catholic-ruled political entities set up in the Levant and southeastern Anatolia. They lasted quite a while, from 1098 to 1291.
They were.
Going from north to south, you had the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the big one, the Kingdom of Jerusalem.
And that name, Outremer.
It's French for overseas. It really reflects that these states were ruled by Franks, Western Europeans, far from their homelands.
So how did these Frankish settlers manage life as essentially a ruling minority in a region with such a diverse local population? Was it constant conflict, or did they find ways to coexist?
That's a great question, and actually, it's a point of ongoing debate among historians, as reflected in our sources. Some older views emphasize segregation and conflict.
Okay.
But more recent scholarship, well, it points towards something maybe more like a rough tolerance, at least in day-to-day life. The Frankish population was largely urban, and yes, sometimes isolated from the indigenous Levantine peoples. They had separate legal and religious systems.
But not total separation.
Not entirely. Our sources show evidence of shared villages, even shared churches in some areas. And importantly, the Frankish settlers had to adapt. They often shifted from that initial militant holy war rhetoric to a more pragmatic stance.
Pragmatic how?
Well, relative religious toleration became necessary. They engaged in truces, even occasional alliances with Muslim neighbors, simply because they relied heavily on the local majority population for farming, for labor, and crucially for taxes. Survival dictated a certain level of coexistence.
Right, practicality kicks in. So while the Crusaders were setting up these states, the Muslim world wasn't just standing by. What was their initial response to this Frankish invasion? And how did that response evolve over time?
Well, initially there was a fair degree of disunity among Muslim rulers in the region.
Internal conflicts.
Exactly. Things like the Sunni versus Shia split, regional rivalries.
Yeah.
It meant they were often, as one source puts it, more likely to wage war on each other than on Christians in those very early stages. But that doesn't mean they didn't resist. The Frankish invasion was absolutely viewed as a grave desecration, especially the fall of Jerusalem. That was a profound shock.
How important was Jerusalem to them?
Immensely. There's a quote in one source that really captures it. If Mecca was the body of faith, then Medina was one wing and Jerusalem was the other. The idea being you needed both wings for the faith to, well, fly properly. Losing Jerusalem was seen as a disastrous blow, recorded with great sadness.
And out of this shock and resistance came a revival of the concept of jihad, didn't it?
Yes, absolutely. A key figure here was al-Salami, a scholar in Damascus. Starting around 1105, he began preaching jihad.
What was his argument?
He essentially argued that the Frankish invasion was God's punishment because Muslims hadn't been upholding their duty of jihad. He taught that fighting the invaders became a personal obligation, what the sources call far arsain for all capable Muslims because Muslim lands were under attack.
So defensive obligation.
Yes, in that context. But he also emphasized what's known as al-jihad al-akbar, the greater jihad, the internal struggle against the evil impulses of the soul. It wasn't just about fighting externally.
And literature played a role too.
It did. Works praising the virtues of Jerusalem, this genre called Faha literature, were revived. They helped reinforce the city's sanctity in Muslim minds and foster a greater sense of unity against the invaders.
And out of this revived spirit of jihad and unity came some truly significant leaders for the counter-crusade. Who were some of the key figures our sources highlight?
Three figures really stand out in the 12th century. First, Imad al-Din Zangi. He died in 1146, but he secured the first major Muslim victory over the Crusaders at Balat back in 1119. And crucially, he captured Edessa in 1144. That was huge. People saw him as chosen by God.
Okay, Zangi the father.
Then his son, Nurdan Zangi, he ruled from 1146 to 1174 and is often regarded as the real architect of the effective Muslim response. He continued his father's work, unified Syria, and showed incredible foresight. He actually commissioned a beautiful minbar, a pulpit, specifically for the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem years before it was recaptured.
Wow, planning ahead.
In anticipation of its reconquest, yes.
And then, of course, the most famous name, Saladin. What was his role in all this? How did he rise to prominence?
Right, Saladin, or Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, he died in 1193. He actually rose through the ranks under Nur al-Din, leading armies into Egypt. Eventually, he succeeded in uniting both Egypt and Syria under his rule, creating a powerful bloc surrounding the Crusader states.
And his motivation? Was it purely political or religious?
The sources suggest he was deeply dedicated to what they term jihad passion. He's often described as a genuine religious leader whose primary aim became the recovery of all Crusader-occupied lands, especially Jerusalem.
But some historians question that.
Yes, some Western historians have argued his focus on Jerusalem only really emerged later in his career, perhaps for political expediency. But many Muslim scholars, looking at the contemporary sources, dispute this, arguing his commitment to liberating Jerusalem was consistent throughout his rise.
He's also famously often lauded for his chivalry, isn't he?
Yeah.
It's quite a contrast sometimes drawn.
He really was famed for it, especially in European accounts later on. Our sources highlight examples like his relatively kind treatment of Crusader prisoners of war after major battles, and how he reportedly showered gifts and money on poor Christian families after retaking Jerusalem.
Which stood out compared to?
Compared to the Frankish conquest of Jerusalem back in 1099, which was notoriously bloody and involved massacres of the city's inhabitants, Saladin's actions presented a stark contrast.
Now, this leads us to a massive turning point you mentioned. All this Muslim momentum, this unity under Saladin, culminates in the Battle of Hattin in 1187. This is absolutely pivotal, wasn't it?
Absolutely pivotal, game-changing. Saladin brilliantly, or perhaps ruthlessly, lured the main Crusader army, led by King Guy of Lusignan, away from reliable water sources into really arid, difficult territory near the Horns of Hattin.
The classic tactic.
A classic, devastatingly effective tactic. Saladin's forces then employed further tactics, lighting brush fires to create enormous amounts of smoke, making breathing difficult and adding to the heat and thirst. They even reportedly emptied water jars in plain sight of the desperate Christian army.
That's psychological warfare, too.
Absolutely. The sources even mention that the Christian army's horses had refused to drink contaminated water the night before, so they were already severely dehydrated heading into battle.
So exhausted, thirsty, smoke-filled air. What was the outcome for the Crusaders at Hattin?
The outcome was swift and brutal. The Crusader army was utterly broken, promptly defeated, as one source puts it. King Guy himself and many of his most important barons were captured.
A huge blow to their leadership.
Massive. And perhaps just as significantly, symbolically, the relic of the Holy Cross also was lost on the battlefield.
Wow.
The consequence was immediate. Within just a few months, Jerusalem itself, now largely undefended, fell to Saladin. It marked a major Muslim victory and a dramatic reversal of the gains made by the First Crusade nearly a century earlier.
The momentum truly dramatically shifted after Hattin, which then sets the stage for later crusades trying to regain Jerusalem. But then we get to one of the most, well, infamous campaigns. The Fourth Crusade, around 1202 to 1204, This was intended to recover Jerusalem, but it went very, very wrong, didn't it?
Oh, spectacularly wrong. It's often described in the sources, even contemporary ones, as a disgraceful affair. Instead of heading to Egypt or the Holy Land to fight Muslims, the Crusaders ended up diverting to and ultimately sacking Constantinople.
The capital of the Byzantine Empire, the greatest Christian city in the world at the time.
Exactly. The very empire they were originally supposed to help defend, ironically. The reasons were complex, a real tangled mess.
Like what?
Well, there were long-standing tensions, theological and political, between the Latin Catholic West and the Greek Orthodox Byzantines. There was also a financial issue. The Crusaders had made an over-optimistic contract with the Venetians for transport ships and couldn't pay.
Ah, money problems.
Big money problems. And then a claimant to the Byzantine throne turned up, offering to pay their debts and give them aid if they helped him get installed in Constantinople. It was a series of, let's say, poor decisions driven by circumstance and ambition.
And the result of the sack was pretty shocking, even for the Pope at the time. What did it mean for the broader crusading movement?
It was devastating. Treasures from ancient Greece and Rome, priceless artifacts and relics housed in Constantinople were pilfered and transported across Europe. Libraries were burned. Many Western Christians themselves saw it as a shameful event, driven by greed, not piety. Pope Innocent III, who had initially called the crusade, was apparently horrified by the outcome.
And the legacy?
Profoundly damaging. The sources suggest the mania for crusading declined significantly after this. And the ultimate irony was, as one source notes, it led to the destruction of the Byzantine Empire that the Crusaders had sworn initially to protect. It fractured the Christian world even further.
After such a major disillusioning setback like the Fourth Crusade, it seems almost incredible that people would still rally for the cause.
But then we encounter these really strange stories of the Children's Crusades in 1212. Were these purely myths, or was there some kind of true tragedy behind them?
It's a mix, it seems. They were, at best, a profound tragedy, though perhaps heavily embellished over time. The core story, according to our sources, is that inspired by supposed divine visions, two distinct groups of young peasants, probably better described as youths or adolescents, not necessarily small children, gathered in France and Germany.
And what was their belief? They seemed to believe that their innocence and purity would ensure divine approval, that they could succeed where the sinful adult knights had failed. They apparently thought they could recover the Holy Land, some even believing God would part the Mediterranean Sea for them, like the waters of the Red Sea for Moses.
That's quite a leap of faith. And what actually happened to these groups? Did any of them reach the Holy Land?
No, none of them did. It ended tragically for both. The French group, reportedly led by a 12-year-old shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes, who adopted the Oriflamme banner, a famous French royal standard.
Okay.
They marched south to Marseille, fully expecting the sea to part. When it didn't, many were disillusioned and went home. But tragically, others were apparently tricked by unscrupulous merchants, named in some accounts as Hugh the Iron and William the Pig, who offered them passage.
But didn't take them to the Holy Land?
No. They were sold into slavery in North Africa and Egypt instead. Just horrific.
And the German group?
The German group, led by a boy named Nicholas of Cologne, seemed to believe they would achieve their aim through peaceful conversion of Muslims. They marched over the Alps to Italy, also facing the disappointment of the sea not parting at Genoa. Some apparently ended up becoming Genoese citizens. Others continued to roam.
Did the Pope intervene?
Yes, Pope Innocent III met some of them. He apparently praised their zeal, but wisely advised them they were too young and should return home until they were older. Only a few stragglers ever made it back to their homes in the Rhineland. Most just disappeared, likely died of hardship or disease along the way.
That's just devastating. A complete disaster fueled by youthful idealism and, well, manipulation. And what our sources reveal next is really quite striking. The Children's Crusades are often cited as a plausible historical basis for the famous legend of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Is there a concrete connection there, or is that more speculation?
There's a strong correlation often cited in the sources, yes. The Pied Piper legend itself, which involves the tragic and unexplained disappearance of a large number of children from the town of Hamelin. It has many versions.
Right, the piper lures away rats, then the children.
Exactly. Lures them into a mountain or a cave or onto a ship, and they're never seen again. What's compelling is that one specific version of the legend, the Korneberg version from Austria, explicitly mentions the children being led away to be sold into slavery in Constantinople.
Ah, echoing the fate of some of the French children.
Precisely. That direct parallel makes the link seem quite plausible, suggesting the legend might be a distorted folk memory of the Children's Crusade or similar child migration or disappearance events from that era.
So it's not just a completely fantastical tale. Could there be other historical explanations for the Hamlin disappearance that our sources mention, beyond the Children's Crusades link?
Indeed. While the Children's Crusades connection is strong, other theories are proposed in the sources for the Hamelin event specifically. One is economic migration, the idea that the children didn't disappear mysteriously, but were deliberately led away, perhaps to colonize areas in Eastern Europe, with the Pied Piper figure representing a locator or recruitment agent.
That's more mundane, but possible.
Another theory points to dancing mania, or St. Vitus's dance, a form of mass psychogenic illness that affected parts of Europe in the Middle Ages, causing people to dance erratically, sometimes for days.
Wow.
And perhaps the most chilling theory connects it to mass death from disease, maybe the plague. In this interpretation, the Pied Piper scaring away the rats is symbolic. The rats carry the disease vectors. The children's disappearance represents their deaths from the epidemic. It really shows how historical events, especially traumatic ones, can morph into enduring, powerful folklore.
Fascinating how history and legend intertwine. So, okay, moving beyond the dramatic battles and these tragic side episodes, what about the quieter, day-to-day cultural impact? Our sources suggest that despite the official state of war that often existed, there were actually significant intercultural exchanges happening. What did these look like on the ground?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating aspect that often gets overlooked in the focus on conflict. The sources make it clear that Muslims and Franks engaged in quite a bit of cultural, economic, and information exchange, especially during periods of truce, which were quite frequent.
Like trade.
Trade is a big one. It actually increased significantly with peace treaties. The coastal cities controlled by the Franks became vital maritime outlets for goods coming from the Islamic hinterland, spices, textiles, raw materials.
And this left a mark.
A very tangible one. This interaction was so profound that many Arabic commercial and administrative terms entered European languages, especially Romance languages, through this contact. Oh, things like douane for customs office from the Arabic diwan, or check from sack, an Arabic written payment order, tariff from tariff, meaning notification or definition. The list goes on. It's built into our economic vocabulary.
That's incredible, a direct linguistic legacy. What about the transmission of knowledge, science, ideas?
That was hugely important too, though maybe more prominent through contacts in Spain and Sicily than directly in the Crusader states themselves. But certainly, scientific, medical, philosophical, and religious books were translated from Arabic into Latin during this broad period of interaction. This formed a crucial basis for later significant developments in European intellectual culture, feeding into the Renaissance.
And more personal interactions.
Absolutely. Sources mention the exchange of physicians between camps, sharing of food, sending gifts between commanders, even visits between leaders during truces. And Frankish settlers inevitably adapted to local conditions, adopting elements of local dress, food, housing styles, and even borrowing military techniques and technologies from their neighbors and adversaries.
So given these exchanges, how integrated was society and daily life back in the Crusader states? We touched on the debate earlier, segregation versus rough tolerance. Did distinct cultures live side by side? Or did our sources hint at a more mixed, perhaps complex, reality?
It seems the reality was complex and varied quite a bit depending on location and time period. As mentioned, historians debate the degree of integration. There were definitely discriminatory laws imposed by the Franks on their Jewish and Muslim subjects.
Like what?
Things like preventing non-Christians from inhabiting Jerusalem itself, sumptuary laws dictating what they could wear, and often a poll tax levied specifically on non-Christians, clear signs of a hierarchical society.
Right.
But, on the other hand, some sources suggest that Muslim villagers under Frankish rule might have actually fared similarly, or maybe even slightly better in terms of taxes and stability, than they sometimes did under shifting Muslim rulers in that turbulent period. And what's also notable is that some mosques were allowed to remain in Muslim possession within Crusader territory. Yes. And there are documented cases of shared cultic rituals and reverence for certain holy places shared between Muslims and various Eastern Christian denominations living under Frankish rule. So it wasn't always a picture of stark separation. Coexistence, even if sometimes uneasy, definitely happened.
And what about the artistic and architectural legacy? Did the Crusades leave a visible imprint on the landscape beyond just, ruined castles?
Oh, absolutely. The military architecture is probably the most impressive artistic achievement of the Crusader period, as one source states. And it wasn't purely European. It demonstrates a fascinating synthesis of the European, Byzantine, and Muslim traditions of fortification.
Like Crac de Chevalier.
Exactly. Castles like Crac de Chevalier or Margat are incredible examples. They were powerful symbols of Frankish dominance, but they also incorporated sophisticated Oriental features learned locally, like concentric defenses, bent entrances, and massive water reservoirs essential for surviving long sieges in that climate.
And beyond castles.
Visual culture, too. Things like the decoration of shrines, manuscript illumination, icon painting. These often showed the influence of indigenous Christian and even Muslim artists employed by Frankish patrons, leading to a kind of cultural synthesis in the arts.
And we can't talk about the Crusader states without mentioning the military orders, the Knights Templar, the Hospitallers. They were like the backbone of the defense, weren't they? How did they function beyond just being elite warriors? Our sources paint a pretty broad picture of their roles.
They were absolutely crucial and really quite a unique phenomenon. They emerged as this new form of religious organization, part monk, part soldier. The Hospitallers actually started as a nursing confraternity caring for pilgrims in Jerusalem.
Right, focused on charity initially.
Yes. But they, along with the Knights Templar and later the Teutonic Knights, evolved into these highly disciplined professional soldiers operating under monastic vows. They essentially acted as the first real standing armies for the Crusader states, providing a permanent defensive force.
But they were more than just soldiers, weren't they? They became incredibly wealthy and powerful.
Immensely so. What's fascinating is their economic power. Through vast donations of land and money from across Europe, they accumulated enormous wealth. They ended up operating almost like supranational trading houses and credit institutions.
Really? Like banks?
In a way, yes. They developed sophisticated systems for transferring funds across long distances, making it safer for pilgrims and crusaders to travel without carrying large amounts of cash. They were major players in the medieval economy.
So, like medieval multinational corporations, but with swords and monastic vows, that's quite a combination. And did they still engage in charitable work despite all this military and financial might?
Yes, remarkably. The Hospitallers, for example, never abandoned their original charitable mission. Their hospital in Jerusalem was famous, reportedly serving hundreds of patients at a time, and importantly, sources say they treated people of all religions and genders. It's a surprising, complex layer to their identity.
It really adds another dimension. So as we approach the end of this nearly 200-year period of the Crusader presence in the Levant, how did these states ultimately decline? What were the key factors that led to their final downfall in the late 13th century?
Well, several factors converged. Internally, they were often severely weakened by chronic infighting feuds among the Frankish nobility, rivalries between the Italian trading cities like Venice and Genoa, who had interests there, and even conflicts between the military orders themselves. That disunity was a constant problem.
Externally.
Externally, the decisive factor was the rise of a new, formidable power in Egypt and Syria. The Mamluks.
We mentioned them earlier, the former slave soldiers.
Exactly. They overthrew their Ayyubid masters, Saladin's dynasty, and established their own sultanate. And leaders like the Mamluk Sultan Baybars were incredibly effective military commanders and, as the sources note, ferocious exponents of holy war against the remaining Franks.
And they delivered the key blows.
They did. Aybars inflicted devastating defeats. He sacked the city of Antioch in 1268, massacring much of its population. He captured mighty castles like Carac de Chevalier a few years later. The Crusader territories just kept shrinking.
And the final act was the very end.
The final end came in 1291. The Mamluk Sultan Al-Ashraf Khalil besieged and conquered Acre, which was the last major Crusader stronghold and the capital of the remnant kingdom of Jerusalem. Its fall effectively marked the end of the Crusader states on the mainland.
And the Mamluk policy after that.
Their policy was quite deliberate, to systematically destroy all physical evidence of the Franks along the coast, raising fortifications, destroying ports, partly to prevent any possibility of a future European seaborne invasion. This policy, sadly, also effectively ruptured the long history of coastal city civilization in the Levant, which had roots stretching back to antiquity. So, if we try to connect all this to the bigger picture, it's just abundantly clear the Crusades were far, far more than a simple religious war, wasn't it? They were this incredibly complex tapestry of ambition, faith, violence, desperation, and also, quite unexpectedly, profound intermingling between cultures. The sources reveal not just the battles and the politics, but these deep intellectual, social, and economic exchanges that really did reshape both the East and the West in lasting ways. And maybe this raises an important question for us even today. In an era we often view through a lens of just stark opposition, how much do we tend to underestimate the deep and often really surprising ways that cultures truly interact and influence each other, even perhaps especially in times of intense conflict?
That's a really powerful question to end on. And understanding that complexity, the nuance revealed in the sources, is absolutely key to truly being well informed about this era, isn't it? Because the very idea of crusade itself, well, it clearly survived long after 1291. It lived on in memory, in imagination. It regained profile through romantic literature, like Sir Walter Scott's novels in the 19th century. And that term crusade, it even became a kind of shorthand for any campaign or cause with moral right, sometimes completely detached from religion or the military. And as our sources note, it was invoked, sometimes controversially, in much more modern political contexts, from General Franco in Spain to George W. Bush's initial phrasing of the War on Terror. But perhaps looking back, the most significant long-term impact, as some historians argue, might actually be that significant and ultimately positive influence, despite all the violence on European civilization, maybe even feeding into the Renaissance, precisely because of that intense, prolonged interaction with the Islamic world's knowledge and cultures. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Crusades. We really hope you discovered some new and surprising facts in the sources that will encourage you to keep exploring this incredibly multifaceted period of history.